In the 10th century in Kiev, an entire city is engulfed in flames. Cries of agony from thousands of men echo as the fire devours them. From the top of a hill, a woman observes the scene, impassive. Her countenance reveals no horror or regret, only pure satisfaction. This is Olga of Kiev, the sovereign who has just decreed the death of an entire tribe as part of her terrible revenge. How did a princess, who would later be revered as a saint, become one of the most cruel figures of the medieval era? To understand her brutality, we must return to the beginning. Olga was not born to power. Of modest origins, her beauty and cunning captured the attention of Prince Igor of Kiev, whom she married around the year 930. Together they reigned over Kievan Rus, the first great Slavic state in Eastern Europe, a predecessor to Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Their rule was marked by territorial expansion and the consolidation of central power, but also by constant friction with neighboring tribes. Among these tribes were the Drevlians, a people who inhabited the dense forests west of Kiev. Relations between Kiev and the Drevlians were always fragile, defined by territorial disputes and tributes. In the year 945, everything changed. Prince Igor, dissatisfied with the collected tax, decided to return to the Drevlian lands to demand more. This choice would seal his fate. The Drevlians, exhausted by Igor's demands, reacted with extreme violence. They captured the prince and executed him in a savage manner. They tied his legs to 2 young birch trees, which were bent to the ground, and upon releasing them, his body was torn in 2. This barbaric execution was not just an act of rebellion, but an unmistakable message. The Drevlians would no longer accept the sovereignty of Kiev. When the news reached Olga, she was alone with her son, Sviatoslav, a child of only 3 years. To the Drevlians, a widow and a boy seemed no threat. Following the tradition of the time, they sent 20 of their best men to Kiev with a proposal. Their prince, named Mal, wished to marry Olga and unite the 2 peoples. It was an offer that, in the mindset of the era, provided the widow with protection and a new status. However, they completely underestimated the woman they were challenging. Olga welcomed the messengers with false cordiality. She ordered her men to carry the Drevlian envoys in their own boats as a gesture of great honor. The Drevlians, proud of such treatment, did not realize they were being led into their first trap. The previous night, the princess had commanded her servants to dig an immense trench in the palace courtyard. Carried to the spot, the Drevlians were thrown into the deep pit. Olga approached the edge and, observing the bewildered men, asked coldly, "Is this honor to your liking?" Before they could answer, she gave the signal. Her servants began to shovel earth over the men, burying them alive. The screams of the envoys echoed through the courtyard as Olga watched in silence. This was merely the first act of her meticulously planned revenge. Unaware of their envoy's fate, the Drevlians received a new message from Olga. She would accept the marriage proposal but required that they send their most distinguished nobles to escort her to the Drevlian lands. Proud and unsuspecting, they sent the elite of their warriors and aristocrats. Upon their arrival in Kiev, Olga suggested that after the long journey, they should take a bath before appearing before her. The Drevlians were led to a wooden bathhouse, traditional among the Slavic peoples. When all were inside, Olga's men locked the doors and set the building on fire. The dry wood burned quickly, turning the bathhouse into a furnace. No one escaped. Dozens of Drevlian nobles were burned alive, their screams muffled by the thick, flaming walls. Olga watched the blaze until the last cry faded and the building collapsed into ash. The princess was still not satisfied. She sent a message to the Drevlians, informing them that before marrying their prince, she wished to hold a funeral feast in honor of her late husband, in their own land. The Drevlians, extraordinarily, still did not suspect Olga's intentions. When she arrived in the Drevlian land, she organized a grand funeral ceremony with an abundance of mead and drinks. The chronicles state that Olga instructed her soldiers to remain sober while they served more and more drinks to the Drevlians. "Drink," she said, moving among the guests. "Drink to honor my husband." As the night progressed, Hundreds of Drevlian warriors fell into an alcoholic stupor, unable to defend themselves or even remain conscious. It was then that Olga, standing on the funeral mound, gave her fatal signal. Her soldiers, who had remained vigilant and sober, drew their swords and began a methodical massacre. The chronicles mention that 5,000 Drevlians were killed that night. Intoxicated bodies were piled up on the celebration field, mead mixed with blood under the moonlight. Olga supposedly walked among the dead, ensuring that no survivor escaped her vengeance. Even this bloodbath did not quench her thirst for retribution. Olga returned to Kiev and gathered a powerful army. A year later, in 946, she personally led a massive military campaign against the Drevlian capital, Iskarstan, the very city where Igor had been brutally murdered. The Drevlians, now aware of the atrocities committed by Olga, barricaded themselves within their city walls. The siege dragged on for a full year, with the inhabitants resisting fiercely. Realizing she could not take the city by force, Olga again resorted to her cunning. She sent messengers to propose peace. "I have already avenged my husband's death 3 times. I will not demand heavy tributes, only a symbol. 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from each house in the city." The Drevlians, exhausted by the long siege and relieved by the apparent clemency, promptly accepted the proposal. Each household sent the requested birds, which were collected by Olga's soldiers in large baskets. What followed has gone down in history as one of the most cruel and ingenious acts of medieval warfare. Under Olga's supervision, small pieces of cloth soaked in sulfur and flammable resins were tied to the legs of each bird. At dusk, as darkness began to cover the landscape, Olga ordered her men to set fire to these materials and release the birds. Their natural behavior decided the city's fate. Pigeons and sparrows, following their instincts, immediately flew back to their nests, located in the thatched roofs, haylofts, and wooden structures throughout Iskarstan. Within minutes, hundreds of small fires erupted simultaneously across the city. The defenders, caught completely by surprise, could not combat so many scattered fires at once. The fire spread with terrifying speed. Soon, Iskarstan was transformed into an inferno of uncontrollable flames. The inhabitants ran desperately through the burning streets, trying to escape with their families and most valuable possessions. Those who managed to flee the burning houses found Olga's soldiers waiting at the gates and breaches in the walls. The orders were clear. No one was to be spared. Thousands died, burned alive in the collapsing structures. Others were slaughtered as they tried to flee. Some nobles and military men were captured alive, not out of mercy, but for a possibly worse fate. They were enslaved and distributed among Olga's allies as trophies of her victory. The entire city was reduced to smoldering ashes, the smell of burnt flesh hanging over the ruins for weeks. The Drevlian tribe, once proud and independent, never fully recovered from this devastating blow. Their territories were firmly incorporated into Kiev's domain, with heavy tributes imposed on the remaining villages. Olga's revenge was finally complete. 4 waves of brutal retribution had washed away her husband's death in blood. The chronicles suggest she contemplated the smoldering ruins of Iskarstan with a dark satisfaction before returning triumphantly to Kiev. Her son, Sviatoslav, now about 5 years old, had witnessed his mother's ruthlessness, a lesson that would influence his own violent reign years later. The most surprising part of this bloody story is what happened next. A few years after her devastating campaign of vengeance, around 955, Olga traveled to Constantinople, the capital of the powerful Byzantine Empire. During this visit, she was baptized into the Orthodox Christian faith. Emperor Constantine VII acted as her godfather at the baptism, an extraordinary honor that showed the political importance Byzantium placed on the conversion of Kiev's ruler. The same Byzantine chronicles that had recorded her atrocities against the Drevlians with horror now celebrated her conversion as a triumph of the Christian faith over Slavic paganism. The woman who had ordered the massacre of thousands, who had burned an entire city with men, women, and children inside, now received the sacrament of baptism and the blessings of the Church. Olga returned to Kiev transformed, at least in her religious convictions. She dedicated the rest of her life to promoting Christianity in her lands, building churches, inviting missionaries, and trying to convert her son, Sviatoslav, and her people. Ironically, the warrior she had raised to avenge his father proved resistant to his mother's new faith, remaining firmly pagan. It was only her grandson, Vladimir, who would eventually officially Christianize all of Kievan Rus in the year 988. After her death in 969, the transformation of Olga's image accelerated. Christian chroniclers, eager to establish a lineage of faith in the Kievan dynasty, began to emphasize her piety and downplay her earlier atrocities. Gradually, the repentant sinner was transformed into the enlightener. Centuries later, she was canonized as Saint Olga by the Orthodox Church, becoming the patron saint of widows and converts. The legacy of Olga of Kiev remains profoundly contradictory. On one hand, she was an exceptionally skilled ruler in a world dominated by men, who consolidated Kiev's power and opened the door to the Christianization of the Rus, an event that would shape the region's cultural and political identity for the next 1,000 years. On the other hand, her campaign of revenge against the Drevlians stands as one of the most brutal examples of retaliation in medieval history, demonstrating a calculated cruelty that is shocking even by the standards of a notoriously violent age. Today, when we visit modern Kiev, we find monuments honoring Saint Olga. An imposing statue portrays her as a wise and dignified ruler, with no indication of the brutality that marked her reign. The same is true in Orthodox churches throughout Eastern Europe, where gilded icons depict her as a pious saint, often holding a cross and with a halo symbolizing her holiness. The story of her bloody revenge, though documented in historical chronicles, is often minimized in favor of her conversion and contribution to the Christianization of the Eastern Slavs. The case of Olga of Kiev forces us to confront the complexity of human history and the contradictions in the figures we venerate. How do we judge a historical figure who committed unthinkable atrocities but also laid the groundwork for profound cultural transformations? Her story reminds us that the line between saints and monsters can be surprisingly thin, especially when viewed through the distorted lenses of time, power, and dominant religious narratives. The terrible queen who burned thousands of men alive in her relentless pursuit of vengeance was ultimately remembered as a revered saint. Perhaps the most disturbing thing about Olga's story is not just the brutality of her actions, nor even her later sanctification, but how history can turn even the most monstrous acts into footnotes in the grand narrative of the powerful. The revenge of Olga of Kiev remains a somber reminder of the horrors humans are capable of inflicting upon one another when driven by hatred and protected by absolute power.